Yeah. Well, I think that was a good enough introduction of me, so I'll just skip this slide. Okay, so a bit of disclaimer first. I spoke to some of the developers and designers for the games that I'll be discussing today, and it was a really interesting conversation. And then they said, "Oh, but don't tell anyone." So I can't go into an in-depth retelling of the design process for everything that I'll be covering today. And this talk is based partially on my observations as a game designer, a linguist, and a player. I also am not covering every game, so I'm just going to be picking out a few. But please feel free to talk to me about this, as I did a lot of research. Why should you care about fictional languages in games? Well, a lot of successful titles have, in some way or another, used fictional languages in their game. And there's no set approach to doing this, and the level of detail varies based on how important the language is to the game world or the gameplay loop. So typically speaking, constructed languages in other types of media stand alone as a language. So a few famous examples you'll all know about. Klingon from Star Trek, and High Valyrian from Game of Thrones, both which you can learn on Duolingo. But when we... Oh, there we go. So when we consider these, though, most languages in games are actually more of a pseudo-language, so they have some elements of an actual language, but not all of them. So this spectrum is what I'm going to be discussing today. And unsurprisingly, given my theme, I'm talking about The Sims. So the creator of The Sims will write wanted dialogue to convey a diverse range of emotions, but at the same time, writing, translating, dubbing, localizing the dialogue was time-consuming and also quite expensive. So to combat this, he invited these two voice actors to come and speak gibberish into a microphone in response to some prompts, and then remixed that dialogue, which is how we came up with the well-known Simlish saying, Sul Sul. This was also a way of stopping the gameplay from feeling so repetitive, because with The Sims being a life simulation game, hearing the same thing over and over could be quite tiring for the players. So, because the voice actors were from the United States, you can't really say it's true gibberish when they are speaking Simlish. Hear me out. Because because they were from the United States, they are constrained in what they can access in their phonological inventory, so the amount of sounds they have in their own language. So that means when we hear Simlish, they have a very similar range of vowels, consonants, and the prosody is a key part in why Simlish works how it does, because a lot of the meaning is conveyed through how they say it, the stress and intonation. They also have very similar phonotactics, which means permissible sound sequences you can have next to one another. So this is why Simlish can sound a bit American sometimes. But saying that, whether intentionally or not, there's still some unique and consistent differences that can be made between when you compare Simlish and English. So Simlish lacks dental phonemes, so that means things like thin and the. You can't have these noises when you are speaking Simlish. And although Simlish and English are phonotactically similar, you can't have more than two consonants that occur in a sequence. However, you can have some quite unorthodox combinations which English doesn't allow. So I have an example here. Zerpa stambi imba bueb, which of course means there's a stranger in my bed. So when we look at this, in English, stranger is not a so strange word. But in Simlish, because you can't have s, t, and r next to each other, that's not okay. That's a bit strange. On the other hand, bueb would be very strange to hear in English, because the combination b and w together doesn't usually happen at the beginning of a syllable. It can happen between syllables, like in the word cobweb, but when we hear bwa, it sounds quite babyish and baby talk. So when you talk to some of the fans from The Sims, they'll say, oh yeah, it kind of reminds me of like baby talk. So can players understand Simlish? So the similarities I mentioned with American English do actually help the players feel like they can understand it because it's familiar, especially for English speakers, native English speakers. But non-English speakers, when they hear it, normally go, oh, I just thought it was English, until they learn a bit of English and go, oh, no, it isn't. But saying that, players do have strategies for trying to understand Simlish. So, for example, they can recognize some phrases from situational context and repetition. So when I see a sim as a player, I see a sim walking up to another sim and going, Sul Sul, I can probably guess they're trying to say hello. And then when they do that again and say dag dag and leave, they're probably saying goodbye. When I see a baby and a sim cradling a baby and go, nubu, nubu, that's probably baby, right? Similarly, woofum would be dog. And of course, when I hear my sim go, wabba-dee-ba-doo, and running around on fire, I can guess they're probably saying I'm on fire. So, players have also been able to infer meaning from re-recordings of songs that Maxis funded for The Sims. But a lot of this is not canonical to the language that they've created in-house. But regardless, Zurpa Stambi Imbabweb is a line from Katy Perry. So, yeah, I can tell you that bweb means bed. So, yeah, overall, the creation of Simlish has resulted in various types of fan engagement, from self-produced Simlish songs and stories to quite niche social media content. They've also, one sec, I've lost my mouse. Fans have even gone as far to take the lesser-known part of Simlish, the writing system, which is complete nonsense and not consistent between games, and they have tried to create their own versions of it and included it as mods in the game or just for personal use. The next game I will be discussing is Sea of Thieves, which is a 2018 action-adventure game developed by Rare and published by Microsoft. So in Sea of Thieves, you're a pirate, and you need to work together with other pirates to complete quests and find treasure and defend yourself from other pirates, my least favorite part of the game. But the game also has a story with like some very interesting narrative arcs and NPCs. So in Sea of Thieves, I will specifically be addressing the skeleton runes, which are the written symbols of an arcane language in the Sea of Thieves universe. So the first time we see the skeleton runes in the game is actually on an item, which is the box of wondrous secrets, the rarest treasure box in the game. But when that first came out, these symbols didn't mean anything, also the players thought. So it was actually later on, when they were given context in one of the story missions called Tall Tale, that we were able to, as players, start understanding what these runes might mean and their relevance within the Sea of Thieves world. This was relevant in this specific story quest to help them find quest items across various islands. Soon after the release of this content, the Sea of Thieves team started to post more and more about skeleton runes, and they confirmed that this is supposed to be a language that exists between skeletons and skeleton lords, both just for normal use and also to deliver secret instructions. So let's have a look at some of the runes. When we look at this, we can see that there's some fairly non-abstract symbols depicting what you can see. So when I point at the first one, kind of looks like a sun. So we can tell you that's sun. The next one kind of looks like a box, maybe a cage. Oh, yep, that's a cage. And then the next one isn't as obvious, but when I tell you that it's a camp, you can probably see a tent. Knowledge of some other runes and how they are constructed can also help players understand the rest that come along with it. So, I mean, well, we can use our real-world knowledge to maybe understand what these may mean. But when I tell you that's north, you can guess that the next is east, and the next is south, and the next is west. So leading up to the release of Season 3, a specific NPC embarked on a quest which led to the discovery of several rune tablets with unknown runes, and these are examples of the runes which were viewed. You can't use the same strategies as a player to tell what these mean, but alongside them, you could see like their estimated meanings. So an NPC had scribbled grey, waking, moonlight, merfolk next to it. So the players' previous strategies didn't work, of course, but the developers helped the community crack the code in a fairly cool and unique way. In conjunction with this narrative, the cryptic messages and images also containing unknown runes were posted to various social media pages. And with this, so I don't know if you can actually see on the projector here. From this specific example, we can see that there's a rune in the top corner. We can pretend we can see the rune in the top corner, which is this one. And along with the text, the players are able to think about what they saw in game, these scribblings, and go, oh, waking, I saw that in the game, so this probably means wakening. So the creation and use of the skeleton runes led to some interesting engagement with within the Sea of Thieves community, where some players were constructing their own linguistic theories, kind of like in the middle here, on how the runes are designed, and others contributed to a much larger community of fans, like what we can see on the left, where they have the Ancient Isles University. And on their website, Merfolk's Lullaby, you can find all the documentation of the runes, their translations, and estimated meanings. This website has also been officially recognized by Rare as part of their Affiliate Alliance initiative. You can also do pretty cool things on it as well, like check the weather in the game. Yeah. So, the next one, last but not least, we have the Elder Scrolls V, Skyrim, where hopefully most of you will recognize this sound. So, when designing Dovahtul, the dragon language, the team drew on inspiration from constructed languages in other fantasy and sci-fi works, particularly 1984 Dune. So Dune influenced the concept of language as a tool of power and control, which is what we see with Dovahtul. It's a language of power in Skyrim where the words themselves can carry this magical force in the form of shouts or thuums. The designers wanted this language to feel ancient and commanding, with each shout with it directly affecting the physical world. There are various examples of real-world linguistic influences in Dovahtul, some being Swedish, Danish, and German, which makes sense given the world of Skyrim is fairly Nordic, but I think the one that had the most influence on the senior designer, Emil, was Old English. However, the writing system was largely inspired by cuneiform. So when I show you this is the Skyrim version. This is cuneiform, which is an ancient writing system from the Bronze Age, if you are not familiar with it. So in an interview in 2021, Emil shared that the design team wanted to invoke this dragon's fearsome form. So part of why they chose cuneiform is because it looks like a dragon has cut into stone with its talons. So the designs and symbols of and like phonetic mapping and everything actually came later on in the process, and this was like the main idea they stuck with. So on this slide, I'm showing some examples in which in-game culture was captured by the language, as this was a driving force in why they designed Dovahtul like they did. So here we have the word Dova, which means both dragon and the pronoun me. The reason it was designed like this is because this is a language only used between dragons. They had no reason to differentiate between dragon and me because they were one and the same. Similarly, we have bo, which means to fly, to go, to move, to arrive, most movement, because when you're a dragon, you're flying most places. So, as much as the designers wanted to run away with Skyrim and make a fully constructed language, they were operating under some constraints, one of which was that it had to rhyme in both English and the dragon language, likely because Skyrim's music was written in both English and Sul Sul.
Sorry, Steph, but I've only got a few seconds now, so just like to
Okay, yeah. So, yeah, there's some really, right, so lots of interesting comparisons made between real-world languages and Sul Sul, some being like the word order and how we form questions, and fan engagement. So the careful design considerations when creating Sul Sul have not gone underappreciated by fans. Large communities have dedicated time and resources into learning, documenting, and extending this language, and so that they could acquire it as a second language. And some have gone as far as to make their own games. So this is Scrabble in Sul Sul. So to help you to aid in this language learning process, if you're interested in learning it, I highly recommend this website in the bottom right. So some takeaways. What are the design requirements of your fictional language? Are you trying to cut corners so you don't have to localize your game, like in The Sims? Are you trying to create an interesting puzzle for your fans to engage with, both in and outside of the game? Or are you building on the important culture that for the world you have built? You don't need to be a linguist. Most of these people weren't, but it helps. And, oh, look, you've got one in front of you if you want to try this out yourself. You're not limited by the game world, so take inspiration from external sources like other languages or even other constructed languages, because people learn them and understand them for a reason. And how the language is utilized in game will impact how players interact with it. So if you want them to run away with it and make their own language, maybe take a note out of Skyrim's book.
Do you have any examples of bad game languages or ones that you think didn't do things so well?
So I don't know if there's any that are bad. There are ones where it's not a language. In the Legends of Zelda: Link to the Past, they had languages in it, but it was just a bunch of scribbles. There was no pattern behind it or anything, so the players didn't engage with that. So if they wanted them to see that and go, oh yeah, this is really interesting, have the same sort of strategies players are putting into these games, that's not done what it's supposed to do. But I wouldn't say there's necessarily a bad one. It really depends on why you are designing it the way you are. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else? Something that when you were doing your talk came out to me was Animal Crossing, because I feel that it's gibberish, but the inflection and the way that tonality happened meant that you could resonate with what the character kind of sentimentality. Yes, they were translating it in the words, but you can get that even when you weren't looking at it. Do you feel that there is something in these kind of in these languages where we're kind of using our kind of the language knowledge as a way of resonating? Because I feel like that's a global game and it's Nintendo, but I feel like everyone who played Animal Crossing understood what Marshall and all the characters were saying, because it's the way that the language kind of inflects and kind of, then they're happy or they're sad, or if they're crying, it doesn't matter. But do you find that that's one way that you can sort of do that in a way that's not sort of too time consuming in terms of getting localization and stuff like that?
Yeah, so with with Simlish, the reason it feels so familiar is because it has very similar phonotactics to like English, our native, most people's native language that we're playing at the time. With Animal Crossing, so I actually really wanted to talk about this, but unfortunately I couldn't. You can't. It doesn't feel as familiar at first, but the more you play it, the more you start to pick up on certain patterns because of the way they have constructed it, because they sound out every letter in Animalese, and at that point, the players start to get to the point where they feel like they understand it because you are learning. You're getting used to hearing it. But yeah, it's a completely valid way of doing something.
Really nice talk. Good job. Okay, so I was wondering, you see, in language research, you often see that people develop certain personality traits which differentiate between people who speak English and people who speak Hindi, and it differs. Do you think there's any negative connotations to someone playing a game for a really long time and being immersed in a certain language? Do you think there's any positive or negative impact? Has there been any studies on it?
I know there's not been any studies on it,
Okay.
but I think as well, it's not something you can really look at the moment because, like I said at the beginning of the talk, a lot of these languages are not fully constructed. They're not full languages, so you're not becoming fluent in them in the same way. You're not acquiring them in the same way, so they're not having the same effect on your brain. I don't find myself thinking in the dragon language yet, but maybe one day I'll get there. But I think it would be a really interesting thing to look at.
All right, thank you.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much, really interesting talk. I was wondering if you found any particular differences between games that were created like by studios based in character-based languages versus languages that were created by people in like Roman character-based languages. So, for example, games created originally in Japanese or Mandarin versus games created in more Latin scripts. Is there any differences to the languages created from those games, or are they about similar?
There are some really interesting differences. None that come up over and over again, though, because a lot of it is down to how the game has been designed as well. So actually, Animal Crossing is different in Japanese, for example. So because of how they treat each of the different symbols. But yeah, I'd be interested in having to talk about that later. That's okay.
Well, I'm definitely going to come talk to you.
Yeah.
Prepare yourself.
Cool. That was really interesting. Some very different stuff. What I wanted to ask, kind of almost like the flip side to Laura's question, which is, what is your own, not just the ones that we would understand in the examples, but what is your personal favourite language in a game and why?
So I don't have a favourite because my favourite game that does this at the moment and what inspired me to do this talk was Chants of Senna, if anyone's played that. So in Chants of Senna, you're not learning one language, but you're learning several, and learning the language is actually the core mechanic of the game. I don't want to spoil the game, but the way they've put together the symbols, kind of what I looked at in Sea of Thieves, for example, is very interesting, and they do something I don't often see in in-game fictional languages, where they'll change the word order. They'll take inspiration from Arabic languages, for example. Normally, what you see is quite constrained to English because it's just the biggest player base they can handle in that way. But that's my favourite at the moment. They might change.
Cool.
We'll see.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Great talk, thank you. So I've watched My Sims on Fire a lot. I always thought they were saying that they were in pain as opposed to they were on fire. Thought, wanted. Do you think that kind of ambiguity helps the player experience, or do you think game designers should be more specific?
So I think in The Sims specifically, it is particularly helpful because what Will Wright wanted when he made Simlish, because Simlish wasn't just used in The Sims, it was used in SimCity and Spore as well, which is a bit interesting. But because they wanted to avoid this repetitive nature, like being on fire is probably, I mean, actually, no, it's The Sims. So being on fire is probably not very common. But saying, like, hi over and over, like, to somebody who can understand what they're saying, like, might get on their nerves. So I think that ambiguity helps them, because in the sense of, like, it doesn't become as repetitive, and, you know, they can keep coming back to it and enjoying it without being like, oh, gosh, I wish they'd shut up. So...